countries. I myself am from Germany, export-oriented economy that benefits tremendously from standardized setting, particularly if it comes to German products, are still very much overrepresented. And the question, moving forward, and this is the portion of the report that I was responsible for, is to think of a world and how best to balance those interests, to find an agreement on the difference of perspectives that particularly play out between the United States and China. And I'm looking forward to dive into that a little bit in the discussion, but I'll leave it at that and hand it over to Stephanie.
Thanks. Julian, just a quick follow-up. So how are you seeing China's efforts to expand its leadership? How are they being received internationally?
Well, that again depends a lot on the perspective. Again, I think particularly developing countries, they are welcoming Chinese investment to the degree as is, it's helping to develop their infrastructure. You see, particularly within the Belt and Road Initiative, that there are often also strings attached. So many people call it the debt track diplomacy, so to say, of pushing countries into dependencies. And then particularly in the Western world, particularly the United States, often China's ambitions, particularly in the tech sector, are seen mostly from a security angle. Ultimately, the United States and its decision makers are used to a world in which the United States is the unquestioned number one, and China becoming a peer competitor and sometimes even a leader in modern technologies obviously threatens that traditional leadership role and is seen rather critical. And again, from a Chinese perspective, I believe that it is mostly seen as kind of leveling the playing field. Wanting to have a say when most of those institutions, including other agencies, were set up. China was a rural, underdeveloped economy, and now it wants to have the seat at the high table. And what we have seen is that if they don't get the seat at the high table, and this is one of the scenarios that we play out in the report, they build rival institutions. The World Bank and the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank is a very good example. So the decision makers, particularly in the Western world, I believe need to make a conscious decision on how they either want to integrate China potentially along red lines, or whether they want to risk of basically having a new bipolar world with different standards, with rivaling organizations in which the United States and Europe dominates on the one hand, and in other part of the world you have Chinese dominance. I don't think that would serve globalization well and the international rule-based order, but that's something that we can discuss later today.
Terrific, thank you, Julian. Fran, I'd love to turn to you next. What would an increase in Chinese influence over standard setting mean for the U.S.?
So, to pick up on something that Julian said, over the past 2 decades, right, China has seen a quick rise as a global superpower, but that has created some very real tensions with the United States, with its allies, and we can't downplay those tensions, right? We're going to have to deal with it. The Biden administration's sort of stated policy is to cooperate, compete, and confront. I'd put sort of standard setting in the cooperate, compete. I think it falls in a little bit of both. And as the report shows, while China doesn't yet possess sort of an outsized majority in the international standard setting bodies, we shouldn't kid ourselves, right? The Communist Chinese Party has made very clear in their document, China Standards 2035, and President Biden's acknowledged this. They have real goals, real ambitions in this area. Over the last several generations, technology innovation has created jobs, productivity, and been a real economic engine for the United States. And so any US policies that undercut America's competitive edge and embolden China could pose serious risks to our economy and our national security, leading to halted or slowed innovations. I mean, I think the bottom line to me is we should embrace China's entrance for the very reasons Julian mentions. We don't want them to sort of go off. We ought to learn lessons from our WTO experience with China, where they take advantage of the good things and then just don't observe rules that the rest of us observe. But we have to work to ensure that American products, Americans are the best engineered, the most innovative, and in a position to be adopted by these standards developing bodies. Standard setting is just one piece of our larger competition with China, but it'll play a key role, I think, that ultimately assumes their goal is to assume global technological dominance. We have to understand that's their goal. I don't think that means pushing them out. I think it means bringing them in. And because we believe we've got the best products, we ought to be willing to compete, but on a fair playing field.
Brian, we've spoken to this just a little bit already, but I'd love to hear a bit more about how you see the US currently seeking to adjust policy, or where you think they should be adjusting policy to address Chinese influence in the tech space.
You know, the Biden administration's China policy, I think folks have been surprised, does not differ very much from the prior administration's China policy. Trade restrictions and all sorts of things remain in place. We have to look to what they've said so far. Secretary Raimondo's been very clear. We can no longer just play defense with China. We have to also play offense, and it requires a whole of government approach. I will tell you, you know, in the very early years in the war against terror, it was the same things that we were saying, right? I'm not making the analogy to trade and terror. What I'm saying is, as a policy matter, it does require a whole of government approach. And what that means is you have to look across US federal agencies, and they've got to be coordinated, integrated, so that you have a comprehensive approach to this, and don't miss the pieces where China, it may be getting ahead of us.
Thank you, Fran. And Mary, I'd love to hear from you about what the response has been within the standards community to this increased Chinese involvement.
Oh, thanks for that question. And thanks for inviting me to be part of the panel. So I would agree strongly with what both Fran and Julian said. And the response from the standards community to China's increased engagement in various SDOs which have structural integrity and follow WTO principles has been very positive, because, as I believe both Fran and Julian said, one reason for that is we've had experience in the private sector and in the federal government with China going off and writing their own standards 20 years ago with the WAPI telecommunications standard, and there are other more recent examples. And I think our company members and government agency members are all in agreement that it's better to have Chinese representatives, both government and private sector, participating in the global venues where international technology standards are being built from the ground up. It's much more of a risk of making China feel unwelcome at the various tables, and then trying to track alternative solutions that they're providing. And we already see some alternative solutions and alternative structures that China is setting up in some standards areas.
Thanks, Mary. And Paul, I want to just ask you, before we dive into the question of are tech standards a threat, but I'd like to understand how you see these tensions over tech standards playing out in the international stage right now.
Sure. It's an overused but very apt metaphor to think in terms of the United States tends to think of things like playing chess. We play chess. And of course, the stereotype is that China fancies that it plays Go. And Go is actually a better metaphor here, because standards are not about capturing pieces or things. It's about opening up territory and the like. And so I think it's a world where the United States has done a couple of things wrong. One, we aren't thinking big enough, but also we forget how standards really happen. Taking a very Silicon Valley centric point of view, the best standards are created by small groups working in obscurity, who are able to work undisturbed and without distraction. That's how we got things like HTML and HTTP. once the standard's established, what we see is China's strength now is that it's come in and it's patient and it's playing a very long game. The United States, we think we're playing chess, but honestly, from Silicon Valley's point of view, we're not even playing checkers. That each administration has its own focus or the like. It's embarrassing. But I think China has a weakness, and China's weakness is that it is single-mindedly focused on its own narrow interests. And the path forward for the United States, I was a little dismayed by the report because it had such a US focus about how to protect US interests. Well, this is a moment where I think US interests are global interests. And the opportunity here is not to play defense, not to play offense, but to fundamentally change the playing field and to change the game. Someone has to represent planetary humanity in standards. And it may as well be the United States because it sure isn't going to be China.
Thanks for that, Paul. So Mary, I'd like to start with you, but then I'd really like to hear from everyone. Is China's involvement in tech standards a threat to the US? And what should be the US's approach to standards going forward?
And generally speaking, I don't think our ANSI, the Institute, our members, who are all stakeholders in the standards development process, see China's participation as a threat. We see it more as more of an on the opportunity side. I mean, as Paul mentioned, consensus standards development is not a win-lose process. It's more akin to community building, and the outcome of the process will generally reflect the technical contributions of the full range of stakeholders, not the input of a single contributor. So as I said earlier, we value having Chinese representatives at the table, bringing their ideas to the various relevant tables, depending on the technology area, and hopefully becoming better participants, becoming better players in the process. I think the report highlighted a wide range of standards developing organizations, and that's an important point to make. There's the pace of change of emerging technology areas is moving at an ever increasing pace, and the sheer number of standards activities and venues in the past decade has gone up tremendously. Formal consensus bodies, treaty organizations, consortia, open standards work. And so managing all of that is important, and managing Chinese participation as a component of that is very important. And I think one of the things that it begs is better new ways for public and private sector stakeholders to work together, better sharing of information, to federal government sharing what the priority areas are and what the priority security and economic interests are, private sector sharing what they are seeing in the standards, various standards venues. And I think equally important is what we call capacity building. So we want to be at the table, the relevant standards tables. We also want to be the best prepared participants at the table. And that takes capacity building, training, and mentorship, both for federal participants as well as private sector participants.
Stephanie, can I jump in here?
Please do.
So I think while I do believe we ought to embrace China's entry into these organizations, I think we have to do that mindfully and aware that we go about things pretty differently, and our values in terms of how we view data is quite different. To pick up on something Paul said, in the United States, the standards are set by experts and industry leaders. In China, that's very much a government-led process, right? We've seen their Digital Silk Road initiative, and we understand that China's relationship with the private sector is quite different than it is here in the United States, right? In the United States, it is very much an arm's length, and to the extent an industry is regulated, that's public. We see very much in China industrial subsidies, forced transfer of intellectual property, and joint ventures to sort of gain a leg up, a competitive leg up, if you will. I think we have to be very mindful that their data security law is a good indication of how they view the use of data by the government to the government's advantage. We have different views, right, about the personal private information of individuals and their ability to control that. And so as we welcome them in, we must do it cautiously, understanding we have quite different values and objectives And so I think that's got to play a factor in how we view the positions they'll take in these bodies.
Paul, would you like to jump in on that, or Julian, I saw you nodding?
No, I'm just nodding in agreement.
Okay. Discussion closed then. Just kidding. Julian, I saw you nodding. Why don't you offer some counterpoint if you'd like?
No, I agree very much with Francis, and arguing, so to say, for the integration or the accommodation of China's interest in the international system doesn't mean that you should, bend over and just accept everything that they do. Far from it. But I often feel, and there are two things that I'd like to talk about in that respect, is I feel like often, and this is also a focus of the report, often China has become sort of a scapegoat, blaming a lot of the problems that we face in the Western world on unfair Chinese trade practices. I guarantee you that unfair trade practices of multilaterals who, exported their production lines and hid tax revenue in tax haven has hurt the American middle class more than Chinese unfair trade practices have. But it's obviously much easier to, blame it on the Chinese. The second thing is, Paul alluded a little bit to that, arguing on behalf of humanity. China has pretty strict privacy laws. Obviously, they don't apply to the government, but the way that they passed legislation for companies, while the United States, can't even agree on fundamentals of a privacy law, in a way also shows again kind of the utterly divided political system that makes problem solving so hard in the United States these days, and kind of shifts the blame on China or unfair trade practices. So I think the key to accommodate China is to strengthen your own grounds, to show that innovation can be a consequence of a capitalist open system, to have the best products, to have the strongest laws, instead of just calling out other actors in the national system to do something wrong. Because I can tell you that from a European perspective, the time in which one can cash in on political alliances is about to come to an end. Every second German car is sold in China. There's a heavy reliance on the Chinese economy. 128 countries in the world are economically more dependent on China than they are on the United States. So in order to maintain in the leadership role, to set standards, to dictate norms, to set the rules for the 21st century, you need to strengthen your domestic roots. You need to push forward legislation that others look up to, because otherwise you might lose the competition.
So I'd like to turn to, what's your advice to policymakers? How should we be addressing policy standards going forward? Mary, would you like to kick us off on that one?
Sure. And I think I started to answer that earlier. So, I mean, we've been looking at this quite actively over the past couple of years with all the interest on the Hill, and now in the Biden-Harris administration with respect to China and engagement and standards and what the US government should be doing. So our strong advice is that, as I mentioned earlier, we should be expanding and strengthening the public-private sector partnership, better communication, better coordination between government interests and private sector interests. And I think very important, the US government should be a champion for the partnership and strong US participation in international standards. That championship should start by setting a good example as a strong and reliable participant and a partner, providing early notice to federal agency representatives on upcoming standards activities, what's strategically important in the long term, and so on. But I'll also note, wanted to build something a little bit on what Fran said. Yes, many of these emerging technologies, at least some, do bring with them something of a value-laden aspect. Certainly artificial intelligence is an example, and there are a different set of values in Western communities than there are appear to be in China and some other communities, and those do affect the standardization process. But I suppose as somebody who's been a long time in the policy aspect of the technical standards process, we can find important ways of addressing bias, trustworthiness, transparency, and there is a role for standards in that aspect. But standards can't achieve everything. A lot has to do with how standards are implemented and the intentions of policymakers. That is not the role of the standard itself. You provide a good technical basis for use and implementation, but the standards can't achieve everything that policymakers are looking for.
Fran, other advice to policymakers?
So look, first and foremost, I think to Julian's point, we've got to sort of take care of the home front first. And I do think that means that the administration, the Congress has got to not fight the American technological sector, but ought to be supporting it and looking ways to encourage additional innovation. And there's a whole bunch of ways to do that. But it seems to be right now where there's a whole lot of infighting inside the United States about the role of the American Technological Center. To Mary's point, which is, I think, a very important one, we ought to understand that outside of the standard setting bodies, China has used what we call the digital Silk Road to sort of seed their own views on particularly artificial intelligence and cloud computing. When we think about it, they've used Huawei, right, to take care of and set standards for 4G throughout Africa. And that's the sort of thing, right? It's sort of outside the standard setting bodies, but you begin where we're in countries that are in desperate need for technological innovation to take advantage of that, to seed your capability, and therefore sort of outside of the process begin to set standards. I do think that there's a risk that by using that, China's standards then become a norm against which the standard setting bodies are now right outside of. And so I just think we have to be conscious. It's not all going to happen. I think the standard setting bodies are very durable, and we ought, as I said before, we ought to welcome China in, but we ought to understand that the Chinese Communist Party is very aggressively pushing their views outside those bodies as a means of influence.
Thank you, Fran. Paul, did you want to add any commentary on that?
Sure, I would say my advice to policymakers is, for God's sake, look at history. Look at the examples of success in standard settings. The United States has done, on the government side, they've done the best job when they have set the context for standards innovations, and not just the United States, but also Europe. Look at CERN. We're still waiting for the grand unified theory to come out of all of that very expensive equipment. But in the meantime, they gave us the World Wide Web. Tim Berners-Lee could not have done it if he hadn't been employed at CERN. In the United States, similarly, look at all the foundational standards behind the internet came about because of the long money put into the space program. So look at our history and repeat the things we did right. And then above all, for God's sake, don't hot dog, don't swerve, don't turn programs on and off. Don't do to standards in the digital space what the United States has done with the space program.
Excellent cautionary advice, Paul. Thank you. I'd like to invite our audience at this time to submit questions that they have for our panel. While we're teeing those questions up, though, I'd love to turn the discussion to how might the public and private sectors work together to bolster the U.S. standards space? Mary, would you like to start us off on that one?
Well, I think there's a lot of will on both sides to work together better. It's something, speaking of the federal government side, it is not easy, as I think Fran had noted, to get a comprehensive federal government approach to anything beyond a high level policy statement. So I think there is a challenge on the government side to look across the various mission areas that the various federal agencies operated in and try somehow to incorporate a general set of principles with respect to participation in the development of standards that are relevant to their missions, and also use of those standards once they are developed. And on the private sector side, we have a similar-ish set of issues, which is there is a great diversity of views and of perspectives on technology areas. So getting to a holistic set of principles, at least at a high level, where we can collaborate and cooperate will be important. And I think early information sharing is a good first step in the area.
Paul or Fran, did you want to speak to public-private sector engagement? Paul? Oh, sorry, who would like to? Fran, it looks like you're mixed. So
okay, yeah, no, I'm happy to go. Look, I think the greatest thing that the US government can do is actually invest, right? Invest in American technology and innovation to ensure we have the greatest sort of engineering and products that the world can see. You know, the Schumer bill took a stab at that. Things get stuck on Capitol Hill and are the result of horse trading. But I think the idea behind the Schumer bill was right. What we want to see is serious American investment here, because it affects not just, as I mentioned earlier, our economic health, but it ensures our national security. And so this is a good long-term investment. And like investments, look, that we've made in the space program, we ought to make long-term committed investments in American technology, the sector.
Paul, do you think the private sector sees it the same way? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
That's me.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Well, you know, of course, there isn't really a private sector. There are private sectors. The United States has a really bad habit of inventing a space and then walking away from it. That's what we did in space, and that's why it's all tech bros and rockets at the moment, and China's doing the long-term stuff. It's going to sound a little strange, but I think one issue for us is there's way too much concentration of power among private companies in the tech sector. One of the things that's really hurt Silicon Valley is that small companies now don't have the chance to become big companies because they get acquired by other big companies. You will never see a YouTube tower in Silicon Valley because YouTube never went public. It was acquired by Google. And we are in danger of impoverishing our commercial technology ecology in this country. There are way too many big companies soaking up way too many small companies, and we're losing the diversity that led to the richness of our standards activity to begin with. I have nothing against large companies. I was on the technology boards of several of them, but I'm not looking at three-letter companies or telecoms to do innovation on standards. That's the job of small companies. We need to preserve the innovative environment out of which standards of the future will come.
So we have a question from the audience. Would any of the panelists care to comment on China's use of patents, in particular standards essential patents, to pursue their standards initiatives? Would anyone like to tackle that one?
Okay. So I'll jump in first. Yes, standards essential patents are continue to be a factor in particular emerging technology areas, and China and Chinese companies are in some ways simply looking to the practice of their Western counterparts for many years. There are some companies that are hold standards but do not exercise hold patents but don't exercise those patents, and other patent holders that monetize their patents. It's a practice across the technology space. So I think it's important in the context of standards developing organizations that they all have very robust patent policies, which is a requirement under the ANSI essential requirements and under ISO and IEC practice. And by patent policies, I mean policies that look to participants to declare at the beginning of the process that they have a standards essential patent, so that it's out in the open and it's evident to participants what the impact will be. This is a very complicated topic, though, and it is a subject in certainly the United States and in Europe of a lot of litigation.
Would any other panelists like to tackle that one? If not, I'll go to another audience question. Okay, so why don't we turn to how much low-lying fruit, easily done actions like improving information sharing among US government agencies, as one speaker suggested, is out there? Fran?
I guess I'll start. I mentioned it in my remarks. This is always much more complicated than it seems when you're sitting on the outside looking in, right? You have different capabilities in different federal agencies. Each has different legal authorities about how and why and where they can use those authorities. And there is process around their ability to use those authorities. And so what makes it such a challenge is finding every one of those pockets, pulling it in, and having a consistent, comprehensive approach. You know, in the counterterrorism world, it was easier because this was less about technical capability. It becomes a greater challenge where you're talking about technical capability. The US has extraordinary capability in terms of our technology in the military, and that often then is spun out into commercial use. But this is a real challenge. And the question is, who should do it, right? You have a Department of Commerce, you have the US Trade Rep, you've got the Pentagon. Frankly, the only effective way to do it is from the White House, right? Because you have the imprimatur of the president to be able to pull those bodies together and insist that they share information, share assets, and coordinate that capability. And so I think it's going to be incumbent upon the Biden administration, if what Secretary Raimondo is calling for, and I agree with her, is a whole of government approach, that's got to be driven out of the White House.
Thanks for that, Fran. So you're advocating actions from the White House. One of our audience members asked, though, are there other organizations that we need, other standards bodies, other institutions that can help create these safe spaces for collaboration and for effective new standards? Do you all see a need for new standards bodies or new ways to engage? Paul, do you want to take that one?
Okay, I was seeing her smile. I was smiling because the space I'm most interested in is the standards that don't exist yet, and also the standards bodies that don't exist yet. Think of the World Wide Web Consortium, which is a hugely important standards working body. In general, I would say, if we're looking towards the future, imagine it's 1990 and you have no idea that HTTP or HTML is on the horizon, or it's 1974 and you have no idea that TCP just got established. As we're looking ahead, once a standard gets established, everybody wants to fiddle with it. But over the next 10 to 20 years, the standards that'll have the biggest impact are the ones that are going to be created anew. So I would say creating more organizations, and it goes back, I'm looking at my notes here, right at the very start, and I think it was Francis who said standards is akin to community building. And the new organizations we need are the new standards organizations that form around the new standards. You can think of a technology as it's an intellectual watering hole, and everybody gathers around the watering hole and figures out what the structure should be. We need those new organizations. I like the other organizations just fine. Always enjoy the ITU, but I'm more interested in the ones that don't exist.
And if I could just add to that, I think that's a characteristic of what we call the standards landscape. I mean, ISO, IEC, ITU, and others have been around for many, many years. And then consortia come and go. We have some consortia like W3C and IETF that have been established for many years, but most of the folks, the entities in the consortia space, arise as a result of companies coming together to solve a standards challenge, and then they go into abeyance, or they help to solve a problem. And I've talked to lots of our company members about open standards. I mean, in the technology space, a company will have 4,000 open standards projects going at any one time, a much smaller number of projects in formal SDOs, but there is a relationship, and they can feed into one another. So I'm an advocate of a very flexible and evolving standards landscape, to Paul's point.
Thanks, Mary. And actually have a follow-up along those lines. I'm curious to know, how important are the distinctions between different standards organizations? So for example, differences in membership, structure, processes, how much do those things matter?
Well, of course they matter. I mean, how SDOs are structured and how they govern themselves are important. They are also evidence of the SDOs meeting the needs of stakeholders. So the governance procedures and the processes do evolve over time, even in those long existing stable standards developing organizations. So I think it's important to note that a variety of governance structures and processes is an important also characteristic of the field, because the technology challenges will differ depending on a particular application area, and one size does not fit all in terms of how an SDO should organize itself.
So we had another question from the audience. How can US policymakers be convinced to redirect their interest in standards and blocking Chinese participation in standards into more productive policy measures? That is, how can we move the policy conversation away from a standards focus, where the magnitude of the problem is small and likely addressable without much new legislation or policy, to a focus on stimulating US and allied innovation and R&D? So should we shift the conversation away from standards to stimulating R&D and innovation? And how do we move the needle on that? Julian, do you want to tackle that one?
Sure, I'm happy to give it a try. In a way, it's the $1 million question, because when you, for instance, see the debates that are playing out around the infrastructure bill, Biden often mentions China more than he mentions infrastructure, because those are, it's the topic that brings parties together these days. And you could leverage it in a way of moving forward and increase American competitiveness, increase R&D investment, and basically make it foreign policy for the middle class of revitalizing many sectors and creating jobs for the future. And I think in a way that is really the essential question, and that's also the recommendation of the report, is to exactly do that. So, invest in policies that will really make a difference, that will have an impact, that will restore or preserve American leadership in that regard. And I think that the China angle can be helpful, but it also, there needs to be caution that it doesn't become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So, this is kind of a subsequent question I saw in the Q&A. I would hope that Xi Jinping and Biden ought to meet sometime soon in a big summit where they can define red lines, where they can, define, as I think Francis said it in the beginning, where to cooperate, where to compete, and where you want to shy away from, and that will give some assurances both to the private as well as the public sector in which direction those different fields are going. When we've talked to AI researchers, when we've talked to people in academia, there's an incredible uncertainty, because right now it's pretty much a Wild West mentality, and it's a try and error principle, and the potential for catastrophe is certainly there. So I think that even the private sector, most certainly in Europe, looks for some regulatory certainty around those issues, and that must happen at the national, but it ideally should also happen at the international level, and that can only happen if there is some sort of summit.
Stephanie, I'll jump in here. Look, I do think I mentioned this before, and Julian has mentioned it as well. Look, the American government has to invest in R&D and innovation and work with the private sector, which has got the real capability in our country. But when you do that, you can't do that and not acknowledge there's a good deal going out the back door, right? IP theft from China is increased, according to the US Trade Representative, during the pandemic. And so it's the cooperate, compete, confront. We're going to have to confront them on the IP theft, because otherwise the investment is wasted. At the same time, there's not a whole lot of technological literacy in the Congress. And so as they're talking about antitrust legislation, they've got to be careful that they don't hobble American business with legislation that causes unintended consequences. And so I think we have to be willing to work with them in the standard setting bodies, confront them on the IP theft, and be careful of our own sort of legislative regimes that could actually, without intention, hurt American innovation and technology.
Paul?
And if I can jump in there really quick, but Paul, please, you wanted to.
Oh, go ahead, Julian.
Just one comment here. I think what was so detrimental in the last 4 years, particularly during the Trump administration, is that those interests where there is alignment with international partners, intellectual property theft, market access, you can name all of those and Europeans would wholeheartedly agree, but there was no common approach. It was, there was conflict over trade and non-tariff trade barriers within the transatlantic alliance. You had no coordination in terms of US foreign policy, and there's a lot of disappointment on the European side that not much has changed, even though there is a new administration. So I would hope that there is leverage to bring the Chinese to the negotiation table if you do it in a multilateral setting, if you use, the WTO. But the renaming of judges is still certainly at a hold. There's not really a commitment from the American side to whether they actually would want the WTO to be existing in the form that it has in the past. And those are for me lost opportunities, because you won't be able to tackle China all by yourself. There is common interest, but you need to leverage it moving forward. Otherwise, it's like close to midnight.
Fran, did you want a quick rebuttal on that, and then we'll turn to Paul?
I agree 100%. I mentioned earlier, I think people are disappointed that there hasn't been a greater change from the Trump administration to the Biden administration when it comes to China policy. And I agree with Julian wholeheartedly. The only way to be effective here in bringing China to the table is with our transatlantic allies, and we've not taken adequate advantage of that. I think this administration will, but we haven't seen much yet.
Paul, over to you.
We're all sort of tiptoeing around the big issue, and that's the politicians. The problem in the United States is that the reward structure is entirely wrong for our politicians. It's why you could shoot a cannon down the main hall at the State Department and not hit anybody, because nobody's been confirmed. And, we have about 3 ambassadors around the world. Unless we create an environment where we change the reward structure for politicians to make these things possible, everybody's going to spend their whole time in all the agencies in Washington trying to figure out how to get around making sure the politicians don't screw it up. Life here in Silicon Valley was a whole lot better when, members of Congress had no idea what the internet was and thought it was a bunch of pipes.
Mary, I wanted to give you a chance to jump in and add any thoughts.
I mean, no, I completely agree with what the other panelists have been saying. It's not easy to to move the federal government structure writ large. I speak from having been on the government side and now on the private sector side. I think to be a little biased because of my background at NIST. NIST plays a unique role in the standards space and in standards coordination. It's a small agency. But 25% of the technical staff at NIST participate in standards, and it is considered part of their performance plans that it's a good thing to participate in standards. And NIST's reputation as a non-biased technical arbitrator of technology issues is respected in the private sector as well. So there's some, I want to be a little glass half full. I think reinforcing NIST's role in coordination wouldn't hurt.
Thanks for that. And we'd like to now turn to, we always like to end our panel discussions with a 1 to 2 minute kind of summary thought recommendation that came out of this conversation today. What really struck you? Julian, I'd like to start with you, if I may.
Sure. So I'll tackle again the 30,000 feet view because that's where I feel comfortable. I think when it comes to a holistic China policy, it would be very beneficial to actually have a strategy. What are the end goals? Earlier there was a comparison made to the war on terror. And when you look at Afghanistan, when you look at Iraq, there was never really a clear end goal of what ought to be achieved for the mission to be accomplished. So when it comes to China, and I'm again also not comparing the war on terror with the China focus, but when it comes to China, what is ultimately US strategy towards China? Is it about preserving hegemony? Is it about turning China into a democracy? Is it about finding a level playing field? Is it about a balance of interest? And before you haven't answered that question, all of those playing fields that we talk about, whether that's standardization, whether that's the South China Sea, whether that's Taiwan, are playing themselves out in a sphere where there are no clear X and Y angles, so to say. So I would hope that moving forward, and that would also give clarity for allies in Europe in particular, there's a clear goal. It can be along the lines of competition, cooperation, and conflict when necessary, but also indicate towards China to which extent you would accept their role in the international system. Because unless that isn't defined, there's always going to be the challenges to the status quo, and you kind of go down into a dangerous spiral where different perceptions and different perspectives lead to an ever-ending competition, and you have deglobalization and all the nasty stuff that nobody can want in the 21st century as a consequence.
Thanks, Julian. Mary, I'll turn to you next. What's your sort of final recommendation or thought coming out of this conversation?
Well, so one final thought is that I was really happy to see this report. It's a very welcome addition to the growing body of literature on international technology standards, and I think takes an important data-driven approach, which we haven't seen in some areas over the past couple of years. And what I found most compelling about the discussion here and about the report is the recommendation to focus on supporting increased R&D and innovation, because we all need to be at the table, private sector and government, but we need to bring good technology ideas to the table. Unless we do research and development and maintain a capacity to develop and lead in new technologies, we're not going to be able to contribute to global standards effectively.
Thank you for that, Mary. And Paul, I'd like to turn to you next, and then Francis,
Sure.
I'll let you have the closing word.
I just want to put 3 lines under Mary's earlier comment that standards is about community building, that we have to view this as a community with different players, and that means even Congress has to play nice. And we, as the old saying goes, it's a lot smarter to stand on each other's shoulders than each other's toes. It's all about community.
Thank you, Fran.
Okay. So I do think I'm going to use the framework of cooperate, compete, confront. One, I do think we have to take a lesson actually from China's digital Silk Road and engage in more what I call digital diplomacy, because it's outside the standard setting body, but it goes to Mary and Paul's point about community building. On the cooperate front, as the report says, we ought to welcome China in. I just think we have to do that with an awareness and an eye towards the China strategy of 2035, where they want digital dominance. I do think in the confront area, we've got to confront the IP theft, as I said, because when you get to the compete, what we're asking for is the US government to invest more with the private sector in innovation and R&D. And in that score, Congress has got to sort of catch themselves from creating regulations they don't understand that will hobble innovation. And so I think we can do all 3, cooperate, compete, and confront. And I think that's got to be part of the US-China strategy.
Thank you so much for that, Fran. To our panelists today, thank you so much for joining us in this really rich conversation. Clearly an important topic and one that will really shape the future of the US and the globe. Again, I'd like to thank our audience for attending and joining us for this conversation. And please do check out our report available on the GeoTech Center webpage, and we'll have that information in the notes. Thank you all again today for joining us.